in Kiev that were placed there in advance of this war. And they were foiled by subversive anti-war members within Russia's Federal Security Service, this according to the Daily Mail, the successor to the KGB, who alerted Ukrainian officials. Ukrainian Secretary of National Security and Defense confirmed the attempts. One group that reportedly tried to kill him was the shadowy Wagner group, which has 400 members located in Kiev. They infiltrated Ukraine with a 24-name kill list. So they have a hit list of assassinations that they are supposed to undertake on behalf of Putin. The other group was Chechnya, which are elite soldiers as part of the Russian National Guard and are known for their brutal tactics. And of course, Zelensky is the #1 target. So Putin came to power and has held power through assassination. Now, how do we know that? Because it's very, very well documented. In fact, our country has warned the United Nations, and the United Nations is well aware that Russia has a kill list of Ukrainians to be detained or killed should they capture any of these individuals, including Zelensky, his cabinet, members of parliament, journalists, on and on and on. And in fact, Homeland Security Newswire, yes, I do my research, has put together, way back in August of 2020, the list is longer now, Putin's victims, a long list of people who've been disappeared or murdered, who dared to question Putin. We have, his intelligence operatives have killed many domestic critics, opposition politicians, journalists, investigative reporters, academicians, and artists, and more than a dozen Russian defectors, like Alexandra Letovnenko in London in 2006. Russian intelligence operatives have also killed Russians who were not outspoken critics of the regime, leading Russian experts to speculate that Putin has adopted a milder version of Stalin's tactics of random killings in order to instill a generalized sense of fear and insecurity in the Russian elite. And they provide a list, again, this list is a year and a half old, of 16 politicians, opposition politicians, business people who wouldn't go along with Putin's ideology, and also, such as it is, and wouldn't give him a piece of their action. He's killed diplomats. He's killed 122 journalists whose deaths were arranged by operatives of Putin and his regime. And it goes through the list, who they are, why he targeted them, and how they were murdered. Seems pretty serious to me. I'll just give you a few examples. Boris Nemtsov, 2015. In the 1990s, he was one of the leaders of post-Soviet Russia's young reformers. He became deputy prime minister and was for a while seen as possible presidential material, but it was Putin who succeeded Yeltsin in 2000. Nemtsov initially supported the choice, but he grew increasingly critical and was pushed to the margins of Russian political life. In February 2015, military involvement in Ukraine, Nemtsov was shot 4 times in the back by an unknown assailant within view of the Kremlin. Putin took personal control in the investigation into the murder, but the killer remains at large. Boris Berezovsky, 2013, a self-styled tycoon who was a member of Yeltsin's inner circle in the late 1990s. He was instrumental in Putin's rise to power, including a media campaign that smeared Boris Nemtsov, who was upcoming with Putin to succeed Yeltsin. But Berezovsky soon fell out with Putin and left Russia for a comfortable self-exile in the UK. The distance from Russia emboldened him, and he declared that he would devote his and his considerable wealth to bring down Putin. He was also leading a campaign to investigate the November 2006 killing in London by the radioactive substance polonium in 2010 of Alexander Litvinenko, a former KGB agent who became a leading critic of Putin. In 2018, a British intelligence investigation established that 2 agents of the FSB, the KGB successor group, killed Litvinenko by slipping the radioactive material in his tea. You remember this. Anyway, Berezovsky was found dead inside a locked bathroom at his home in London, a noose around his neck, in what was at first deemed a suicide, but the coroner's office could not determine the cause of death. And it goes on and on and on. Well, Mark, why do we care about any of this? We'll get to that in a minute. Then we have this document from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, no doubt a neocon operation, no doubt about that. The federal contractors behind this, no doubt about that. Putin's not-so-secret mercenaries, patronage, geopolitics, and the Wagner Group by Nathaniel Reynolds. This is the Wagner Group that up until now you probably have never heard of before. Just a few points. Moscow first deployed Wagner in Ukraine at a time when the Kremlin needed to fight a covert war, hide casualties from the Russian public, and mitigate the international repercussions of a gross violation of a neighbor's sovereignty. The use of this is a tactic with deep roots in Russian history, most notably during the Cold War. By using so-called volunteers and other groups of the irregulars in Ukraine, Moscow nominally reduced the number of active duty personnel and concealed their presence, at least initially. The recruitment of these groups happened quickly in 2014, and the Kremlin turned to private and state actors to finance and organize the effort. What else? Russia's covert war in Ukraine sparked Western alarm over Moscow's use of mercenaries and other deniable instruments of subversion. This is back in 2014, which are often lumped together as part of a so-called hybrid warfare. Concern remains that Moscow might secretly deploy Wagner or similar forces elsewhere in the post-Soviet space to start another covert war, destabilize a country through sabotage and subversion. By using mercenaries, as it did in Ukraine, Moscow would hope to sow confusion around its involvement, keep the West divided, and stay below obvious thresholds for a robust response. Mark, why are you getting into all these things? We know that Putin is a killer. We know he's an assassin. We know his interests in the countries that surround Russia. We know he wants to rebuild the old Soviet Union, actually the Russian Empire. He wrote a long essay about it over the summer. What does that have to do with us? Everything. We have a Putin wing in the Republican Party. We have a Putin wing in the media. We have a Putin core in the Democrat Party and in academia. And you'll hear them and you'll see them, and they talk about how the United States may escalate war against Putin. Now, it's they, Lavrov and other lapdogs of Putin, who has talked about nuclear war. It is Putin himself who's talked about nuclear war. We're not. And they really ever criticize Putin, or they do it in a passing way in order to say something about the United States and how stupid we are and how stupid our generals are and so forth. Now, there may be that. I mean, Biden is the so-called commander-in-chief. He is a disgrace and a disaster. He actually has the Russians negotiating with the Iranians on a nuclear deal with us. What kind of a fool does that? I will never know. He puts more sanctions on the American oil industry and no sanctions on the Russian oil industry as I speak. What kind of a fool does that when we can use oil to debilitate the Russian economy, the Putin economy and war machine, rather than debilitate you, Mr. and Mrs. America? We do have a damn fool in the White House. There's no question about that. And we should be muscling up our military for any possibilities. And we're not. Despite spending trillions and trillions of massive debt, we're not muscling up the United States military. Russia, China, Iran, the axis of evil, the real axis of evil now that exists. Well, why does this matter? Because, ladies and gentlemen, I personally am sick and tired of hearing the excuses for Putin and the attacks on the United States, that we somehow are going to escalate something. We have been incredibly passive in the face of what Putin is doing. Diplomacy? Diplomacy? Look who the diplomats are. Look at the Secretary of State. He's pathetic. Look at the National Security Advisor. He's pathetic. We've never had such a pathetic team in modern American history, up against true, vile, genocidal maniacs. Xi, the regime in Tehran, and yes, the fascist Putin, who's busy running around and calling the Jewish leader, president of Ukraine, a Nazi. Think about that. The bad guys, the evil guys, are the Russians. They're not the Ukrainians. They're not the Americans. They're not the NATO forces. But what does bother me is the Ukrainians need weapons to defend themselves. They were promised MiG-29s, and their pilots can fight in MiG-29s. That's what they use. All of a sudden, they were pulled back. I don't favor sending American infantry into Ukraine. Does anybody? I don't think even Lindsey Graham does. I don't favor a no-fly zone with American Air Force jets and so forth. But can we at least give these freedom fighters the right to defend themselves? They're now being brutalized. They're being slaughtered. They're being shot in the streets. Their women are being raped. There's torture taking place. What does this have to do with the United States? Do you think Putin is going to be happy with Ukraine any more than he was happy with Crimea, any more than he was happy with Georgia? He's told us what he wants to do. You think he's building hypersonic missiles to attack Kiev? He's building hypersonic missiles to get around our defense systems. The way China's building their Navy and their hypersonic missiles, you think they're doing that to attack Taiwan? Do you think the Iranians are building intercontinental ballistic missiles to hit Tel Aviv? They don't need intercontinental missiles to hit Tel Aviv, for which they want to put warheads on. By the time this administration's done in Washington, the Iranians will have nuclear missiles, China will have conquered Taiwan, and Russia may well be marching into other countries. Who's to stop them? And by the way, I would remind you, Taiwan's not part of NATO. Does that mean we don't help defend them? Israel's not part of NATO. Does that mean we don't help defend them? What about South Korea if they're attacked? Do we not do anything about that? Where is the line for the appeasers, for the sellouts, for the neocon artists who are out there preaching peace or provoking war? You know, these genocidal maniacs, when they see weakness as they did in our withdrawal from Afghanistan, which was an absolute horrific disaster where 9,000 American citizens still are behind enemy lines, where 13 brave Americans were slaughtered for no reason. You know what? When the enemy sees weakness, the enemy strikes. So they see weakness in the Oval Office, they see weakness around the Oval Office, they see weakness, much weakness, in our media, and they see weakness, period. Period. We should be arming up the Ukrainians with whatever they need.
Absolutely.
That's number one. We should turn on our oil and natural gas spigots like never before, drive the Russian military machine into the ground, and stop their troops cold. Number two,
Absolutely.
We should cut off all negotiations with Iran immediately, let alone having Russia as the point to negotiate. That's why Biden will not put sanctions on their oil, because he supposedly needs the Russians to negotiate our deal with the Iranians. That's what we need to do, and then lastly, build up the United States military that needs it. When I come back, we're going to have the great retired Colonel, British Commander Richard Kemp. I'll be right back.
Compensation. Call 1-800-714-9300. That's
with 300 British soldiers under him. He's a combat veteran. I could go on and on about his commendations, not just with the British, but all over the world. Gives advice all over the world on national security. It's good to have you, Colonel Kemp, at a time like this. Okay, I'm going to throw you a very broad question, because I'd like your take on this. You see what's happening in Ukraine, you see the response of NATO, you see the response of individual countries. What do you make of this?
I think what we're seeing now is the response of Russia to American weakness and European weakness and the weakness of NATO. And I think really he watched very carefully when President Biden ordered the disgraceful withdrawal from Afghanistan, and he sensed strong weakness there. He really did. He sensed that this was his opportunity, as he took the opportunity when Obama was in power to seize the Crimea in 2014. He didn't do anything when Trump was in power because he didn't know how Trump would react. He saw him as a volatile and probably stronger leader than either Biden or Obama. So now he was faced with Afghanistan. He smelt weakness and he went for it. And that, I think, is the fundamental beginnings of this particular war. Yes, of course, it's Putin, not Biden, who is responsible for what's happened. But I think our weakness, US, Britain, NATO weakness, is what has led to this situation. And you spoke earlier about whether or not Putin should be taken out of this game. My question would be, why shouldn't we take him out? He's the military commander, he's the commander-in-chief of the Russian forces who have unprovoked invaded Ukraine, killed many, many Ukrainians, and is going to kill many, many more. Why would we not take him out if we think that could end this terrible situation and end Putin's further aggression? If, for example, rather than appease Hitler in the 1930s, we focused on getting rid of him, we would not have had the Second World War, and we would not have had the millions of people that were killed following that. So yeah, he should be taken out one way or another. He should be brought down, and brought down as rapidly as possible. Now, if you can't actually physically take him out, then you can focus on And I think it should be NATO's primary strategic objective to see Putin come down, to see his downfall, and encourage, as much as we possibly can, encourage whatever resistance exists in Russia, and it's not very strong, it's not very good, but we should be encouraging them to bring him down as well. And we should also be supporting whoever we can identify as a potential less evil leader, because let's make no mistake about it, that Putin is the #1 threat to the West in Europe at the moment. He will not stop at Ukraine. He may well bring down the Ukrainian government and occupy Ukraine, and hopefully will then suffer the severe consequences of that in a lengthy insurgency conflict. But that will not be the end of it. He will then go for the Baltic states, he will go for Finland, he will go for Moldova, and he will have his eyes on even countries even further west than that, such as Poland. He will not stop. He will continue to be our main enemy, and we need to do everything we possibly can to neutralize that threat.
I share your amazement that what Lindsey Graham said here is so supposedly controversial. The real assassin is Putin. The real mass murderer is Putin at home and abroad. The real threat to the world, waving around nuclear weapons, is Putin. He's the one who's escalating things. We keep talking about de-escalating all the time, and I think that actually empowers him and motivates him as well. But I don't know of any war, quite frankly, where top generals or others haven't, in fact, been targeted. Yamamoto was targeted during the Revolutionary War. British generals were targeted by the American militia. All these wars, I think what's shocking to so many people is that the United States Senator dared to mention it, and yet here's Putin, who uses hit squads, the Chechens, the Wagner Group, regular military, more than any leader that I know of. Maybe Xi is an exception, or Wen's an exception, to murder people, whether they're in London, whether they're in Washington, D.C., hotels, wherever they are. He's not worried about escalating anything. I want to ask you, when we return, about this bizarre situation where the United States is using Russia as the negotiating point for the United States with Iran over a nuclear deal with another enemy of the United States that seeks to build ICBMs with nuclear warheads. Why in the world, from your perspective, would the United States, would the President of the United States be using Putin as our negotiating individual with our enemy in Iran, who also keeps threatening to destroy the United States? When we come back, we'll get the answer. I'll be right back.
In the capital city of Kyiv as catastrophic, and reports of incoming heavy artillery destroying residential buildings on the outskirts of Kharkiv. That is, of course, Ukraine's second largest city, a desperate time there. And now major tech platforms, Netflix and TikTok, are joining other companies in pulling out services from Russia. Russian users of TikTok will no longer be able to post on the app, while Netflix watchers in the country won't have access to movies there. The actions further isolate the Russian people from the outside world, as the companies hope that the withdrawal of their services will help stop the invasion. I'm Kevin Cork in Washington. Back to Life, Liberty, and Levin.
Colonel Kemp, it is inconceivable to me that we'd be using the Russians. We're doing what they're doing right now, threatening us as they escalate the war in Ukraine, as our go-between with the Iranian regime, who keeps threatening us and wants the okay to build ICBMs with nuclear warheads. What do you make of this?
It is a parallel universe, Mark, to be honest. I would never have dreamt, even relatively recently, that the President of the United States would not only be so hell-bent on giving Iran nuclear weapons, which is what this deal actually does. It's just a pretense that it in any way slows down or prevents them becoming a dangerous nuclear power. It paves their way. This deal was created by President Obama, and ever since he entered office, President Biden has been determined to get it back on track after Trump took it off its tracks. And he will stop at nothing to achieve that. He sees it as not only restoring Obama's legacy, but also creating his own legacy. And the very idea that we should be using as a go-between between the United States and Russia and Iran. We should be using the very country to negotiate a nuclear deal that has been threatening us with nuclear attack just in the last few days, and that has been firing on nuclear power stations. And we want to use them in some way as a mediator, some way to facilitate negotiations between Iran. It is total insanity. And I think, the Israelis keep reminding us, and we should bear this in mind regarding Russia directly as well. The Iranians keep reminding us that when a leader threatens us with annihilation, whether it be the supreme leader in Iran or whether it's Putin in Russia threatening us with annihilation, which they have done. Khomeini has made it very clear that he sees Israel as a country that needs to be destroyed and eliminated, and he plans to do so by nuclear weapons. Putin has threatened us with nuclear weapons, and the Israelis remind us frequently that when somebody like that threatens you, you must take it seriously. Of course, many of their people suffered the consequences of a leader in the past, Adolf Hitler, who threatened to annihilate them and did so to a very large extent. So we cannot allow this to continue. We should not be allowing any form of normalized relationships with Russia. I believe we should sever diplomatic relations anyway. We should probably stop any Russians from traveling to our country. We should certainly cut off trade totally with Russia, isolate them, make them a pariah state. Certainly not use them to negotiate a nuclear deal with a country that has a proven track record of terrorism, extremism, that intends to have a nuclear missile arsenal that will not only threaten the Middle East, not only threaten Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, other countries in the Middle East, it will also directly threaten us, because his ballistic missile program is not designed to deliver nuclear weapons into just the Middle East. It's designed to have the range to deliver nuclear missiles into Washington, D.C. and London as well. So this is not a situation we can tolerate. The deal should be immediately stopped. Negotiations for the deal should be immediately stopped. And as we should isolate Russia, we should also isolate and cut off relations with Iran. They should both be pariah states, and their leaders should be brought down if we possibly can. And hopefully with more reasonable leaders installed that we can do business with and that don't threaten our countries and our people, as both of these despots have been doing.
Everything you just said, Colonel Kent, is used by the Putin wing of the media, the Putin wing of the political parties in this country, as a statement of provocation. You see, if the West defends itself, if allies defend allies, trying to avoid all-out war, trying to avoid all-out confrontation, then it is the West that's at fault. It's the West that's escalating. It's the West that's instigating. And so when a maniac like Putin talks about nuclear weapons, or the maniacs in Tehran talk about nuclear weapons, that's our fault. And we should put our head in the sand and just let well enough alone. And if they take out Israel, they take out Israel. They take out Ukraine, they take out Ukraine. And by the way, we're told NATO is weak, so the hell with NATO. Don't worry about NATO anymore. These are very dangerous people who are going to create a massive world war, aren't they?
There's no question about it. And there's a saying that appeasement provokes and strength deters. Had we had strength, not the debacle of a withdrawal from Afghanistan, and a unity in NATO to oppose Putin, had we had the strength to do that, rather than appeasing him, rather than making our economies, certainly in Europe, almost completely reliant on Russian energy, had we done that, we would not be in the situation we're in now. I think the one thing probably that would have prevented Russia from invading Ukraine was deployment of NATO forces there before he even began. But there was no possibility of that, because Europe has no strength of resolve. They're afraid of Putin, and they've shown they're afraid of Putin. President Macron in France was doing everything he could to negotiate and facilitate Putin in the vain hope that he might be able to talk him down. Of course, he was never going to be able to do that. Germany, under Chancellor Merkel, spent years kowtowing to Russia, and we can see the consequences now. We can see that together, Europe, NATO, and the United States have created this situation that we're in now, and they've allowed and provoked, as I mentioned, provoked Putin into the horrific aggression that he has now delivered into Ukraine, and will undoubtedly take further on if he's allowed to survive. So it goes back to the point I made and that you were discussing before, that Putin has to be brought down. He has to be ended one way or another. His reign of terror in Europe, and particularly over Russia, needs to be terminated, and that needs to happen as quickly as possible before he has the opportunity to invade any more countries and before he has the opportunity to totally destroy Ukraine, which is what he's going to do if he's allowed to continue doing it. There's no way that NATO forces are going to intervene. There's no way that anyone's going to actually physically stop him, despite the bravery, the heroism and the strong resistance of Ukraine. They will be overwhelmed, they will be overcome by Russia if Putin continues on this course. So yes, as you mentioned, we should be arming them to the teeth. We should be doing everything we can to help the Ukrainian army keep fighting. But our overall priority should be ending the reign of terror of President Putin.
All right, Colonel Kent, thank you very